19 years old, and she owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a cracked leather satchel, and $2 silver that rattled together like the last two teeth in an old dog's mouth. Her uncle, Warwick Doyle, the only kin she had left in this world, had put her out on the road that morning with a look on his face like he was setting down a sack of feed he no longer needed, telling her the farm was sold, and there was no place in the new arrangement for a niece who ate but did not earn. She walked 12 miles into the town of Widow's Creek, Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1887, with the wind already carrying the smell of the first hard frost, and she spent one of those $2 on a plate of beans and cornbread, because a person cannot think clearly when her stomach is screaming louder than her fear. And with the single dollar that remained, she did something every soul in that town would later call foolish or lucky or touched by the hand of God, depending on who was telling it. She bought for $2 she did not fully have, the deed to a collapsing, weather-blackened cabin on the ridge above the creek, a place the townsfolk had not set foot in for 11 years because they said a curse lived in its walls. She did not know, as she pushed open that swollen door and let the dust sift down over her like fine gray snow, that sealed inside those rotting boards was a secret that would not only save her life, but would one day make the whole town of Widow's Creek stop and stare and reckon honestly with itself for the first time in a generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Della Mae Calloway. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, a town, a home, or even just a season of your life that others have written off, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Della Mae Calloway had not always been without a family who wanted her. She had been born in the spring of 1868 in a modest farmhouse outside Bozeman, the only child of Thomas and Ruth Calloway, a wheelwright and a seamstress who had come west from Ohio with little more than tools, thread, and a stubborn belief that a person's worth was measured by the care they put into their work, not by the coin it brought them. Della's earliest memories were of her father's workshop, the sweet smell of curing wood shavings, the rhythmic knock of his mallet against a wheel spoke, and her mother's voice humming hymns while her needle moved in and out of cloth with a precision that made even mended flour sacks look like something worth keeping. Thomas Calloway used to say that everything discarded still had a use in it somewhere, that a broken wheel could become a garden trellis, that a torn coat could be turned inside out and worn another 5 winters, that nothing on God's earth was truly worthless, only unlooked at. He taught Della to read the grain of wood with her fingertips before she could read her letters, taught her to see the strength hidden in a knot others would have cut around, taught her to notice what other men threw away. Her mother, in turn, taught her patience, the particular unglamorous patience of unpicking a bad seam and starting again rather than hiding the flaw beneath a hurried stitch. Together, these two ordinary, unhurried people gave their daughter a philosophy she did not yet know she was being given. That value is very often disguised as ruin, and that anyone in too great a hurry will walk right past a fortune without ever seeing it. When Della was 11, a diphtheria outbreak swept through the valley in a single miserable winter and took both of her parents within 9 days of each other, leaving her in the care of her father's younger brother, Warwick Doyle. For Warwick was in fact her mother's stepbrother, a hard, calculating man who ran a modest freight business and who took Della in less out of love than out of a grudging sense of obligation he never let her forget she owed him for. For 8 years she worked his household and his ledgers without wage, milking, mending, cooking, and increasingly, because she had a plain gift for numbers inherited from nobody knew where, keeping his account book straight when his own arithmetic grew sloppy with drink. She was never struck, never starved outright, but neither was she ever, not once in 8 years, told that she was wanted. She learned to make herself small and useful, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to find whatever scrap of dignity she could in doing careful work even when no one thanked her for it. It was, in its bitter way, an education, the same one her father had begun without knowing how it would be finished. An education in seeing worth where others saw nothing, and in surviving on the strength of her own 2 hands when the people around her offered none of theirs. The end came on an ordinary Tuesday in September of 1887, when a land agent from Helena arrived at the Doyle farm with papers already signed and a check already written, and Della understood, standing in the doorway with a basket of eggs still warm in her hands, that her uncle had sold everything. The house, the stock, the tools that had once been her father's, without a single word of warning to her. Because in his eyes, there had never been a reason to warn a girl who owned no part of any of it. He told her, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that the new owners had no use for an extra mouth, that he himself was moving on to Butte where a man could still make money, and that she was 19 now, old enough to make her own way as plenty of women did. He gave her $2 silver, her wages, he called them, though it did not begin to cover 8 years of unpaid labor, and put her on the road with her satchel and the clothes on her back, and that was the whole of the reckoning. Della did not cry in front of him. She had learned long before that tears cost more than they were worth in that house. She walked the 12 miles to Widow's Creek because it was the nearest town of any size, and because somewhere in the back of her mind she remembered her mother once speaking fondly of a cousin who had lived there, though whether that cousin still lived or lived at all, Della had no way of knowing. She arrived at dusk, footsore, hollow with hunger, and entirely without prospects, a condition made only more frightening by the fact that Widow's Creek in the autumn of 1887 was itself a town on the edge of its own quiet ruin. Its once promising silver claims largely played out, its main street lined with more shuttered storefronts than open ones. Its people carrying the particular weariness of a place that had hoped for more than it got. She spent her first dollar on food because the alternative was fainting in the street, and she stood afterward in front of the land office with her very last coin in her palm, watching the lamplighter make his rounds, and wondering with a kind of numb, exhausted clarity what a person was supposed to do when she had exactly $1 and absolutely nothing else in the world. It was old Hiram Bledsoe, the land agent, who told her about the cabin, more as a joke than a genuine offer, when she asked if there was any work or any room to be had anywhere in town for so little money. He laughed, not cruelly, and said the only property in Widow's Creek a body could buy for $1 was the old Pruitt place up on Corbin Ridge, and he'd sell it to her for $2 just to be rid of the deed, because nobody in 11 years had wanted so much as walk past it after dark. He told her, half in warning and half in the relish men, taken telling a spooky tale to a stranger, that Josiah Pruitt, the silversmith who'd built the cabin with his own hands back in the boom years, had vanished one autumn night in 1876 under a cloud of accusation. The towns collected to say off his silver, nearly $4,000 worth belonging to a dozen small claim holders who'd pooled their earnings for safekeeping, had gone missing the same week, and though nothing was ever proven, Pruitt's sudden disappearance had been taken by nearly everyone as a confession written in absence. His cabin had stood empty ever since, its roof sagging, its doors swollen shut, its name in town synonymous with theft, ruin, and because 2 boys had claimed years back to have seen a lantern moving inside it at midnight, with something not quite natural besides. Della, standing there with $1 in a town that had already shown her exactly how much a person without means was worth, found she did not much fear a dead man's ghost. She feared the cold far more, and the prospect of another night with no roof at all far more than that. She gave Hiram Bledsoe her last $1, promised the second on credit against whatever work she could find, and walked the mile and a half up Corbin Ridge in the last gray light of evening to see, for the first time, the things she now owned. The cabin was smaller than she expected and worse for wear than even Hiram's warnings had prepared her for. Its log walls silvered with age, its single window shuttered and thick with cobweb, its doors so swollen with old rain that she had to set her shoulder against it, and heave twice before it groaned open into a darkness that smelled of dust, mouse nest, and the peculiar cold mineral scent of a forge long gone out. She struck one of her few remaining matches and found, in its brief orange light, a single room with a stone hearth at one end, a rusted anvil and forge tools at the other, and a narrow loft above reached by a ladder with 2 broken rungs. It was, by any sane measure, a ruin. But Della Mae Calloway had been raised by a wheelwright who saw strength in a knotted plank and a seamstress who saw a whole garment in a torn one. And so instead of despair, what she felt, standing in that cold and broken room, was something closer to recognition, the sense that she and this abandoned place understood each other, both of them written off, both of them still, underneath the neglect, entirely capable of being made useful again. She spent that first night wrapped in her own coat before the cold hearth, too tired even to be frightened of the shadows the townsfolk swore moved on their own. In the gray light of the following morning she began, out of sheer necessity, to make the cabin livable. It was on the third day, while she was sweeping the accumulated filth of over a decade out from beneath the loft ladder, that her broom caught on something that should not have been there, a floorboard that gave a little too easily beneath the bristles, its edge not quite flush with its neighbors the way honest would have left it. She knelt, worked her fingers into the gap, and pried the board free, and found beneath it a shallow cavity dug into the earthen floor, and inside that cavity, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff with age, a small iron strongbox no bigger than a hat box, its lock long since rusted to uselessness, and beside it, folded flat and tied with wax cord, a thick bundle of papers that had somehow, in 11 years of damp Montana winters, been kept almost entirely dry. Her hands were shaking, not from cold this time, as she worked the rusted lock apart with a forged chisel she found among Pruitt's old tools, and lifted the strongbox lid to find, packed in careful rows and wrapped individually in scraps of felt, dozens of small silver ingots stamped with a mark she did not recognize, a crescent moon over a stylized letter P, along with a modest number of gold and silver coins that even Della, no expert in such things, understood at a glance represented more money than she had seen in her entire life. But it was not the silver that held her attention longest. It was the papers. She untied the wax cord with fingers that had gone clumsy with disbelief and found herself holding what appeared to be a ledger, written in a small, careful, deliberate hand, recording dates and weights and names. The very names, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold cabin air, of claim holders whose descendants still lived in Widow's Creek. Tucked inside the ledger's back cover was a letter, its ink faded to brown, addressed to no one in particular, as though the writer had composed it more for his own conscience than for any reader he expected to have. Della sat on the cold floor by lantern light and read it through twice before she could fully believe what it told her. Josiah Pruitt had not stolen the town's silver. He had discovered, in the summer of 1876, that the man entrusted with the Collective Assay Fund, a rising young banker named Elias Thorne, who had positioned himself as the town's most trusted financial hand, had been quietly skimming from the pooled silver for months, replacing weighed ingots with lighter counterfeits and pocketing the difference. A theft that would have ruined a dozen small, claim-holding families the moment the fraud was discovered at final settlement. Pruitt, a careful and unassuming man who kept the assay office's scales in good repair as a courtesy, and so had noticed the discrepancy before anyone else, confronted Thorne privately and was met not with confession, but with a threat. Thorne warned him that a lone silversmith's word would never outweigh a respected banker's in that town, and that if Pruitt spoke a single word of it publicly, Thorne would see to it that Pruitt himself was accused of the very theft he'd uncovered, using his influence with the sheriff and the assay office to make the frame stick. Rather than risk it, and rather than let the true silver simply vanish into Thorne's pocket, Pruitt had done something quietly extraordinary. Over the following weeks, he had gone to the assay office by night, using his own key as a contracted repairer of its instruments, and had gradually replaced Thorne's counterfeit ingots with the genuine silver Thorne had already skimmed off and hidden in his own home for later collection. Silver Pruitt located and, in effect, stole back, hiding the true metal here beneath his own cabin floor, along with a meticulous ledger proving every ounce and every name it belonged to, intending to find a way to return it safely once he could do so without Thorne destroying him first. But before he found that way, Thorne discovered the swap, realized Pruitt had outmaneuvered him, and moved first, accusing Pruitt publicly of the theft before Pruitt could accuse him, using his standing to turn the town against a humble silversmith almost overnight. Pruitt, seeing the noose tightening and with no proof yet safely delivered to anyone he trusted, made the desperate choice to disappear rather than hang for a crime that was, in cruel irony, the very crime he had prevented. The letter ended with a single line that Della read a third time, alone in that cold cabin, with the wind picking up outside. If these words are ever found, let them find their way back to the families who earned this silver honestly, for it was always theirs, and I would rather be remembered as a thief who vanished and see good people ruined by a true one who stayed. Della did not sleep that night, not from fear of the cabin's reputed ghost, but from the enormous, dizzying weight of what she now held. A fortune large enough to change her own life entirely, and alongside it, proof that could restore the good name of the man the whole town had spent 11 years condemning, and restitution owed to families who had, by every account she'd already begun to piece together from town gossip, spent the past decade believing their silver simply lost to bad luck and worse management. She thought of her father's voice, telling her that nothing discarded was truly worthless, only unlooked at, and she understood, sitting there in the dark, that this cabin, this dollar's worth of ruin, had been the truest example of that lesson she would ever be given. But she understood something else too, something that frightened her nearly as much as the money itself. That Elias Thorne, the man who had framed an innocent silversmith 11 years before, was, as she'd already learned simply from listening in town, still very much alive, still very much respected, and now the president of the very same Thorne Trust Bank that held the mortgage papers on half the failing claims in Widow's Creek. A man like that would not simply step aside and let an orphaned 19-year-old girl unravel 11 years of carefully maintained respectability without a fight. She was careful, in the weeks that followed, the way her mother had taught her to be careful with a difficult seam, testing each stitch before trusting it, unpicking anything that did not lie true. She did not rush into town waving the ledger. Instead, she began, quietly, to make herself known as simply the girl who'd bought the old Pruitt place and meant to fix it up, taking in mending work from the handful of townswomen willing to give a stranger a chance, using a portion of the coin, carefully, sparingly, claiming it as savings she'd carried from her uncle's farm rather than reveal its true source, to patch her roof and repair her door and buy proper food, all while she spent her evenings by lantern light cross-referencing the ledger's names against the town's current families, learning who was still there, who had moved on, who among the original claim holders had since died, leaving children or widows who might still be owed. She discovered that nearly every name in that ledger belonged to a family still living within a day's ride of Widow's Creek. Families who had, in the years since the theft, fallen into exactly the kind of quiet, grinding poverty that follows a community once its promised prosperity is stolen out from under it. The Ostrander family, who'd lost their claim outright to foreclosure the following spring. The widow Simmons, who'd taken in washing for 15 years to make up the difference. Old Ezra Voss, half-blind now, who still spoke bitterly of that Pruitt scoundrel every time the subject came up at the mercantile. It struck Della with a force that settled deep in her chest that she was not merely sitting on a fortune. She was sitting on the power to correct 11 years of a wrong these people didn't even know the true shape of, and that the man responsible for both the original theft and the framing of an innocent man was, at that very moment, likely still profiting from the wreckage he'd caused, quite possibly still holding, in some vault of his own, whatever remained of what he'd originally skimmed, before Pruitt ever intervened. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Widow's Creek, that word would eventually travel up to Corbin Ridge that the Calloway girl was doing more than patching a roof, that she'd been seen with old ledgers, that she'd been asking pointed questions of the county recorder about, say, office records from 1876, that she'd quietly begun visiting the Ostranders and the widow Simmons and old Ezra Voss with a gentleness and a purpose that unsettled people, even as they couldn't quite say why. Elias Thorne heard of it, as Elias Thorne heard of everything that touched his interests in that town, and he came to Della's cabin himself on a cold November afternoon, arriving in a fine black coat entirely unsuited to the Ridge's mud, his manner smooth and paternal in a way that made the hair rise on the back of Della's neck the moment he opened his mouth. He told her, with the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to being believed, that he understood a young woman alone might be tempted by old rumors and older grudges, that Josiah Pruitt had been a thief and a coward who'd run rather than face justice, and that whatever papers she thought she'd found in that cabin were almost certainly the ravings of a guilty man trying to muddy his own name on the way out of town. He offered, with the air of a great and unnecessary kindness, to buy the cabin and its contents outright for $300, cash in hand, no questions asked, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to Della, May Calloway, a month before, and that he clearly expected would silence and satisfy a girl with nothing. When Della, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, told him she had no interest in selling, his warmth thinned by degrees until what remained beneath it was something considerably colder. And he reminded her, almost as an afterthought on his way out the door, that the Thorn Trust Bank held a great many notes and mortgages in this town, that reputations were fragile things, and that a young woman with no family and no standing would do well to consider how quickly a town's sympathy could turn if certain doubts about her character were allowed to spread. It was not quite a threat spoken aloud, but Della understood it as one. And she understood, too, watching his fine black coat pick its way back down the muddy ridge road, that he had, without meaning to, confirmed everything the letter had already told her. An innocent man does not ride out into the cold to threaten a girl over old rumors he claims are baseless. In the days that followed, Della felt the town's temperature shift the way weather shifts before a storm nobody has yet named. Whispers reached her that her credit at the mercantile had been quietly restricted, that a woman who'd promised her mending work had suddenly found she no longer needed it, that Sheriff Latham had been seen up at the bank twice in 1 week deep in conversation with Thorne. She understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that Thorne intended to starve her out or discredit her before she could ever bring the ledger before anyone who mattered, just as he had once maneuvered an entire town into disbelieving an honest silversmith. But Della had spent 8 years in her uncle's house, learning to survive on careful thought rather than open confrontation, and she did not intend to walk into Thorne's fight on his terms. Instead, she went quietly and one at a time to the very families named in Pruitt's ledger, not to ask anything of them yet, but simply to show them, in the privacy of their own kitchens, the entries bearing their fathers' and husbands' names, the weights and dates recorded in a dead man's careful hand, and to let them draw their own first conclusions before she said a single word about Thorne. She showed the widow Simmons the line reading 14 ounces, silver, held in trust, S. Simmons' claim, and watched the older woman's hands go still over her mending. She showed old Ezra Voss, and watched a lifetime of bitterness toward a dead man crack slowly open into something far more troubling. The dawning suspicion that he had spent 11 years hating the wrong name. One by one, family by family, Della let the ledger speak in its own quiet, undeniable voice, and by the time she finally requested a public hearing before the town council and the visiting circuit judge who came through Widow's Creek twice yearly to settle exactly such disputes, she did not walk into that hearing alone or unbelieved. She walked in with the Ostranders and the widow Simmons and old Ezra Voss, and 6 other families besides, every one of them having seen their own name in Josiah Pruitt's own hand, every one of them no longer willing to simply take Elias Thorne's version of 11-year-old history at face value. The hearing was held in the schoolhouse on a bitter December morning, the whole town packed shoulder to shoulder into a room meant for 30 children, and Della stood before Judge Alden Fry with the strongbox on the table before her and the ledger open in her hands, her voice steady in a way she had not expected it to be, and told the room the story the way the letter had told it to her, of a careful silversmith who had discovered a theft, tried quietly to right it, and been framed and driven out for his trouble by the very man who had done the stealing. She had, by then, done more than simply read the ledger. She had spent 2 weeks with the help of a sympathetic county clerk cross-referencing Thorne's own essay office deposit record from 1876, finding gaps and irregularities in his own handwriting that matched, almost line for line, the counterfeit weights Pruitt's letter described. Thorne, called to answer for himself before the judge and the assembled town, tried first denial, then indignation, then, as Della calmly produced document after document, a kind of cornered, sputtering fury that did more to convince the room of his guilt than any single piece of paper could have. For the townsfolk of Widow's Creek had known Elias Thorne smooth and controlled for 11 years, and had never once seen him lose that composure until a 19-year-old girl with a dollar cabin stood calmly dismantling it in front of them. Judge Fry, after 2 days of testimony and a careful examination of both the ledger and the bank's own records, which a court-ordered audit soon confirmed showed a pattern of skimming stretching back further even than 1876, found in Della's favor entirely. Josiah Pruitt's name was formally cleared and entered into the county record as wrongly accused. The silver in the strongbox was ordered distributed, weight for weight, to the families and heirs named in the ledger exactly as Pruitt had wished, and Elias Thorne was stripped of his position, his remaining assets seized to make further restitution, and bound over for trial on charges of fraud and theft that would, within the year, send him from his fine house to a considerably plainer one behind bars in Helena. What the town had not expected, and what moved more than one hardened rancher to unashamed tears in that crowded schoolhouse, was what Della did next. Under the terms of Pruitt's own letter, a modest finder's portion of the recovered silver was legally hers to keep, more than enough to have set her up comfortably for the rest of her days without another hour of hardship. Instead, she stood before the town and asked that her portion be added instead to a fund for rebuilding the assay office and establishing a proper cooperative bank, one owned collectively by the claim-holding families themselves rather than any single man who might one day be tempted, as Thorne had been, to see other people's silver as his own. She asked, too, that the old Pruitt cabin, her cabin, be preserved rather than torn down, not as a monument to curses or ghosts, but as what it had actually been all along, the home of an honest man who had given up everything, even his good name, rather than let his neighbors be ruined. The town, moved by both the justice of it and the strange, quiet grace of the girl who'd brought it about, agreed without a single dissenting voice. And so it was that Della Mae Calloway, who had arrived in Widow's Creek 19 years old and utterly without means, cast out by the only family who owed her better, found herself, within a single winter, transformed from a homeless girl into the very person who had restored a wronged man's name and a wounded town's fortunes in a single stroke. Not because she had gone looking for treasure, but because she had never stopped believing, as her father taught her over a wheelwright's bench years before, that the things the world calls worthless are very often simply waiting for someone patient enough to look closely. She had bought a $2 cabin the whole town called cursed, and found inside it not a curse at all, but a good man's conscience, preserved 11 years in oiled canvas, waiting for exactly the kind of person who would not walk past it. She had been failed by the family that should have protected her, and had gone on, anyway, to protect an entire community that had failed a man of its own. That, in the end, was the whole of her secret, and it was no curse at all. It was simply value overlooked and finally, faithfully returned. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Della's story tonight. If it moved you, we'd be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need the reminder that nothing overlooked is ever truly worthless. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.